The Carpenter and the Cradle, a History Weaver Adventure, Book 1, by Connie Worden, read by the author. Chapter 36. The group of hikers ate breakfast and broke camp as fast as possible. It was still early morning when the small band of travelers hoisted their packs on their backs and set out. There was very little talk as they made their way down the mountain. They stopped briefly for a hurried lunch by the icy mountain stream, but conversation was sparse while they ate. There was a definite sense of urgency to get back down the mountain. There were too many questions, and none of them could be answered until there was more to go on. June's main thought was finding Georgie. They needed to be sure she was all right, but there were likely so many questions she could answer for them. After lunch, Coral excused herself and wandered off to find a bush or rock. She wasn't sure why no one else seemed to need the facilities. She always seemed to be the only one wandering off to find a private spot, but there it was. She needed what she needed. Nothing looked promising until she spotted the big boulder that looked big enough to completely hide a crouching girl. She made for it, but gulped when she saw how near the edge of a steep slide it was. Her fear of heights was occasionally hampering when it held her back from doing what her friends were doing, but there was no chance she was giving in to it this time. Needs must. She finished what she had come to do and forced herself to enjoy the view, ignoring the steep slope below her and the fine pebbles that would slide so easily beneath her feet if she made one wrong move. A noise behind her jerked her head around, heart beating like a snare drum. Yesterday's events had made her extra jumpy. "Don't be stupid," she scolded herself internally. "It's just one of the girls who decided they had to go too and came to find me." But it wasn't one of her friends who was sending the pebbles skittering downhill as hiking boots clambered down an incline toward her. It was a man, and his black hair was pulled back in a ponytail. She knew she'd seen this face before, and it was the face she'd been watching for all the while they'd been hiking this trail. There was the neck tattoo she noticed in an instant. There was no doubt about it this time. It really was James McKay. Coral became hyper-conscious of the steep ride to the bottom of the slope behind her as James made his way to her. Her head became so light, she thought for a moment she might faint and save James the trouble of pushing her down the hillside, if that was his intention, as her fears all told her it must be. "Hey, could I talk to you for a second?" he said, coming in only an arm's length away. Coral couldn't answer. She couldn't think. She couldn't move. But at the last second, as she believed it would be before he pushed her backwards, a kind of fierce instinct took over, and bracing her back against the large boulder, she grabbed Georgie's stepfather by one arm and pulled with all her might while she extended one foot to throw him off balance. He didn't utter a sound as he fell, but went headfirst into a kind of somersault and continued sliding on his back, feet first, down the steep face of the slope. Coral wasted no time waiting to see what became of him, but ran as fast as adrenaline could carry her back to the group. When she had nearly reached them, her legs refused her weight, and she collapsed into a little heap while the others rushed over to her. She gasped out the most condensed version of her story she could manage, and the guys, as one, rushed off in the direction from where Coral had just come. The girls stayed behind to make sure Coral was all right. Every part of her body was trembling, like she'd just climbed out of an ice water bath, and her teeth chattered uncontrollably. But apart from the shock, she assured her friends she'd be okay. But what would the men find at the spot where she'd pushed James McKay down a mountainside? And would they all be okay? Or were they in danger too? Her mind couldn't stay off the two questions. "You're not my brother," Coe spat out, finally breaking his silence. Nothing felt real. Hab's words refused to process. The stranger's words refused to process, but Coe issued the denial almost without thought at all. No one's words had any meaning anymore. Not Hab's, not the stranger's, not Coe's. Maybe language itself had no meaning anymore. "Will you listen to what I have to tell you?" the stranger asked softly. "Will you hear the story of your life before you can remember it?" Coe glared at him stonily, But as the stranger sat and indicated for Ko to sit as well, Ko sank to the ground. Hab joined them. "I'm the eldest son of Zhao," the stranger announced. "I could have guessed as much," muttered Ko. He knew the name the stranger had mentioned. Zhao was the headman of the enemy people. "But you're his adopted son, my little brother, Dove. That's your real name, and mine is Yosa." "If you're speaking the truth, how did I come to be known as Limo's son?" Ko asked in a surly tone. In spite of himself, he recognized the sincerity in the tone of the man named Yosa. His eyes pleaded with Ko to believe his words. "Your mother was of the people where you were raised, Limo's people. She was a slave and ill-treated. She escaped into the forest after being beaten. Her husband had been put to death by Limo for some minor offense or other, and she tried to save him, so she was beaten severely for her efforts. Her husband was also a slave, and as you know, a man of power can do anything he likes with a slave among your people." Ko hung his head. It had often bothered him, though he tried to tell himself that there was nothing wrong with the way his people treated slaves. After all, they were just slaves. But something buried deep in him had always argued back. Hearing Yosa speak the truth out into the open air suddenly made it appear to Ko as it must appear to Yosa, as cruelty. But what despair struck him at the thought that his own mother had been a slave? Did that make Ko himself of the slave class too? "Your mother was found by our people and taken to live with us. She was already carrying you. Inside, I mean." "You mean my father, the slave, the one who was killed?" Ko could barely get the words out. "Yes, unless Limo is your real father. She was his slave, so there's no knowing, really. But most likely the man who was killed, he was her husband." Ko had nothing to say but listened with his eyes tightly shut and his fists clenched as though in pain. "My father had lost his wife, my mother. He took pity on your mother, and after her time of mourning, asked her to be his new wife. He married her honorably and loved her deeply. He looked on you as his own son." "So, what happened that I was returned to the others?" Ko asked, his eyes still shut tightly to fight back the wetness that wanted to escape from them. That must never happen. What kind of warrior would he be? Hab took up the narrative. "You were taken in a raid. Your mother was killed by her own people as a traitor, and you, as the son of the headman of the enemy, you were a valuable prize. Limo wouldn't have known that you were the son of his slave woman. He didn't know Zhao had married her. It was revenge on Zhao, raising his son as the son of his enemy. The ultimate insult. I was old enough to remember when you came to our home for Limo to raise. My mother, Limo's wife, had died. She died before you were returned. The Cradle was also taken in the raid. You were in it when it was captured, so both prizes were taken as one. A great snatch for Limo's people," Hab finished. "So everyone knows, all the village, I mean, all those who are old enough to remember, that I'm not really Limo's son?" "Yes, they'd all know, but none of them would ever say anything to you about it on pain of death. You know that." Ko nodded. Hab was right there. There was silence. Yosa seemed to be waiting to hear if Ko had anything else to say or to ask. There was an air of expectancy. There was something Ko wanted cleared up. At last he spoke again. "If your people are my people, not my enemies, why did they capture me on my mission after I'd hidden the Cradle in its sanctuary? They intended to harm me, there's no doubt about that. You don't seize a person and tie him hand and foot if you don't mean him any harm." Yosa reached out to touch Ko's arm. "You've been lied to all your life, Ko. It's not Zhao who means you or your people harm. That's not Zhao's way. Those weren't Zhao's men who captured you. The rebels have never been able to get along. Their cruelty and violence have always made them unable to live at peace among themselves. The men who captured you were once from your own people. The people you were raised among have always made war against Zhao's people, ever since their first leader grew jealous of Zhao and rebelled. He stole the Cradle originally. Zhao won it back at great cost to himself, the cradle that you were laid in when you were just a baby. It was my cradle first, but Zhao and I together won it back to lay you in it after you were born. But since then, since Limo took power of the rebel group, another man who wanted to be leader challenged Limo over the cradle. The challenger lost, but he led a splinter group away to form their own village. A rebel group from the rebels. The second rebels have been at war with the first rebels, Limo's people, ever since. Because of Limo's great hatred for Zhao, he pretends that every act of those enemies has issued from Zhao. He leads his people to believe that Zhao and his people are your true enemies, but the ones always trying to capture the cradle is the group that broke away from Limo's people. But the possessor of the cradle is the rightful leader. Zhao has no authority without the cradle. Limo and my people are in possession. The Order of the Guardians have the right of possession of the cradle, and its right of inheritance that passes from father to eldest son, the ruling rights, along with the knowledge of the signs that goes along with it. Without the cradle, the headman is nothing. Zhao is nothing. Limo is the true leader. However we came to have the cradle, we have it now. Without the cradle, the rest of you are only slaves to us. Zhao is nothing more than the head slave. The old Ko, who believed in the absolute rights of the cradle, rose up in protest. He raised his body to his feet as his voice rose in anger at what Iosa was telling him. It was all lies. It had to be. Even if it was true, did it matter? Ko was who he was now. He was Ko, not Dove. Since Hab's desertion to the enemy, he, Ko, was the heir to the ruling rights. He was no slave woman's son. Hab pulled him into a sitting position again. Zhao has always been the rightful leader of his people and of our people. It's the knowledge behind the signs of the cradle that's the important right of inheritance. It's that knowledge that's been passed down from father to son and mother to daughter among Zhao's people. The cradle itself is not what gives Zhao his ruling rights. He's always had them. It's the people of Limo and the original rebels who decided they must take possession of the cradle, even though now they've lost the meaning behind it. They learn the signs, but they don't know what they mean anymore. That's why I left. It was that knowledge that won me over. Iosa met me in the forest one day when I was off hunting. I'd twisted my ankle badly and couldn't walk. Iosa helped me get to shelter and then stayed with me, bringing me food and water. While I was helpless there, he taught me the meaning of the signs. I could tell that he was speaking the truth about my own people. Limo's people, I don't call them my own anymore. After seeing Iosa's kindness, a man I thought was my enemy, I knew I'd been lied to all my life about Zhao and his people. When I learned the meaning of the signs, I knew that this was a knowledge I wanted for myself. I went back with Iosa to learn more from him and his people, and there I've stayed. Ko lowered his brows at Hab. And then I ran across you as I returned from the mission. Do you pretend that you didn't tell the enemy where to find me? No, Ko, there's no pretending. I didn't tell anyone where to find you, except Iosa. I followed you and saw the capture. The enemy stumbled across you on their own. I would have tried to help, but there were too many for me, and they would have taken you off, and I would have lost sight of you if I'd gone back to Zhao's village for help. I looked for an opportunity to help you if I could. So I tracked the men and watched them from a distance. I watched them go after you that night that you escaped. I saw them gather at the cliff above the river and guessed that you had gotten to the river somehow. Then I went to find Iosa to see if he could find you downstream, in case there was a possibility you'd survived. I knew you wouldn't let me come near you. You thought I was a traitor. But I've been keeping an eye on you, little brother. One I think of as my brother anyway. I had my heart set on your rescue and return to the people of Zhao, especially after Iosa told me the truth about your birth and your capture as a baby. That's where you belong, Ko. With me, and with Iosa, and with Zhao. Please come back with us. Ko's heart was torn. He couldn't help believing all he'd been hearing. Hab's face told him he was desperately in earnest, and his heart longed for the brother he'd lost. But Limo was waiting for him back in the cave. It was too much to take in all at once. He needed some time to think about all he'd heard. I can't, he said shortly and strode off. Paul and Coral's brothers were a long time returning. The girls talked little. too anxious to think about anything other than what was happening with James McKay and the other men. They wondered out loud over and over what was happening, but seeing none of them knew, the conversation couldn't get far. Finally, they huddled around each other in silence. Coral had stopped shaking, but she still felt cold inside. What if Georgie's stepfather was seriously hurt? What if he was... She couldn't let her thoughts go there. He'd tried to kill Georgie on more than one occasion, but she was no killer herself, even of a killer. What couldn't be faced was the thought that she could have been responsible for the death of anyone, even accidentally, though not entirely accidentally. She certainly hadn't meant to kill anyone, but sending James McKay tumbling down the face of the mountain had been no accident. She couldn't face the possibility, but she couldn't get her mind entirely steered away from it either. If only the guys would get back already. It seemed half of eternity, but finally the voices of Paul, Rex, and Will could be heard as they neared the group. Coral listened intently to hear how sober their tones were. They sounded serious, but she took some comfort in the discussion she couldn't hear. They were obviously trying to decide the best course of action, but no one seemed distraught. "We found him," Paul said as he joined the girls. "He slid down into a ravine. We had to climb down the long way around so we didn't go down into it ourselves the same way he did." Coral could hardly force the words out. "Is he—" "He's okay," Rex jumped in hastily. "At least, I mean he's alive. He's conscious. He was speaking to us. He can't walk. Looks like he broke a leg in the fall." "I think it'll take a rescue helicopter to come and get him. No way anyone will be able to carry him out on a stretcher all that way. We'd better get back down as soon as we can and get the rescue operation in motion. Won't be good if he has to spend the night up there." In spite of herself, Coral's face crumpled and she turned it away from the group. "Hey, it's okay." Paul wrapped his arms around her like she was one of his own girls. "You just acted out of self-defense. You thought you were in danger and you reacted. You have nothing to feel guilty about, if that's what you're feeling. And he's going to be okay. It'll all be okay." Coral couldn't answer.